Hey, good morning everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of the Dodge Magnum rebuild. This is a 5.9, but you can still do the basic steps, the same thing for a 5.2 Magnum. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to basically assemble a short block. So we're going to go ahead and put the main bearings in. We'll set the crank in here, and then we'll put in some plastic gauge, torque all the main caps down. Take the main caps back off, and then we'll check our bearing clearance. So we're looking, really for this motor about 2,000 clearance. 1 to 2, I'll say. So 2 at a maximum. You could probably go 2.5, but what happens is you may need to refresh the engine after a couple of years when you start getting higher and higher bearing clearances. The other thing you may notice is a little lower oil pressure. Being a fun little street strip car, I'm going to go between 1 and 2 thousandths for my bearing clearances. Now I did leave the rear main seal out at this point, for taking the crank in and out and that kind of thing. So once I go ahead and put the crank in permanently, then I'll take the crank, or I'll put in the rear main seal. So I just want to make sure when I set the bearings in, put the caps in, torque them down, check my, take the caps back off, that my bearing clearances are good. Then I'll take the crank out one last time, clean it one last time. I'll put a little lube on it, set it in there, and then bolt it down. And, at that time, that's when I'll put the rear main seal in. And then what we'll do is after that, we'll go ahead and do our end ring gaps for our pistons. Once we do that, then we can go ahead and put the pistons in, and then we can check our piston bearing clearance as well at that point in time. So I'll check a couple of them. I probably won't check all 8, but at least check a couple to make sure those bearing clearances are good as well. So with that said, let me set up the camera for a little more close-up. We'll install the bearings, like I said, in the block and on the main caps. I'll set the crank in, we'll set the plastic gauge in place, torque them down, and then we'll pop them off, see what the readings look like. So on to step 2. All right, guys, what you want to do is, again, make sure your block is real clean, even though you've probably cleaned it many times. You can see here, I've gone through and cleaned all my bearing surfaces up. There was still quite a bit of crap on the rag. And then I'll do the same thing for my main caps. Just clean them one last time. All these surfaces real good before I put the bearing halves in. So go through, make sure, again, everything is good and clean. Make sure your bearing halves are clean, and then we'll assemble the bearings. Now, the other thing you want to do, guys, is take the time to inspect all your bearings to make sure they're not scratched up. I have received brand new bearings from the manufacturer where, there was some pretty good scratches on them. And then I've had to call them and get them replaced. So inspect all your bearing surfaces to make sure they're nice, they're not all scratched up. And then I normally also like to just wipe them off, just because, of being some machine oil possibly in them, or maybe they'll have some oil, from when they manufactured, right? So I like to clean my bearings up before I install them. Yeah, you can see, guys, that's basically from cleaning brand new bearings. So they do have residue, from the manufacturer. So again, I just take the time to make sure I clean everything really thorough. Now, we'll go ahead and install the lower half of the main bearing. So we want to make sure that the hole here is lined up with the hole in the block. You can see this little tab here, this little tab there will line up with this little notch in the block. So now we can go ahead and set that in. Now, the front two are a little smaller, they were this size. This is your thrust bearing. This is the one that goes in the very center. So it goes in our number 3 spot. So this will go in, this size will go in 1, 2, and 4. 1, 2, and 4. We'll put this in number 3, and then we have a wider one for number 5, which goes at the back of the block. We basically do the same thing to our caps. So we've got the 3 smaller ones. Again, there's a notch in the cap here. There's a notch in your bearing. And just snap them in place. Now, the bearings that I'm using are King bearings. So I've had good luck with King bearings in the past, so these are the bearings that I'm using. Guys, so here's the plastic gauge I'm using. This is I believe by Seal Power. You can see here's the part number for it, SPG-1. And I've cut off 5 pieces, one for each of the main bearings. So what I'll do is open this up. You'll see a little green thin piece of, I'll call it like plastic almost in there. And you'll set it on each cap, basically in the center of, I should say, of each bearing here. You'll set it in the center of each crank journal. And then you'll, like I said, we'll set the main caps on and bolt them on, then we'll knock the main caps off. All right, guys, looks like our main cap bolts, the torque spec is 85 foot-pounds. So I'm going to do this in thirds. So I'm going to basically do, 30, 60, 85 for torque spec. So my first round will be at 30. And I always go in a circular pattern. Start in the middle and work my way out. Because what you won't want to do is start on the outside and work your way in. Because if you start on the outside and work your way in, right, you're going to be doing this, and then you're going to be trying to pull the center of the crank down. By starting on the outside, you're going to be kind of starting in the center, and then, if you will, leveling out the crank when you torque it down. So I always do it in thirds, center, work your way out. And when you're taking a crank out, you want to do the opposite. Start on the outside and work your way into the middle. So, just a tip. All right, guys, so looks like most of the gauge stuck on, in this case, the rear main cap. So what we'll do is, now you can see in the lines, whoops, now you can see the lines here, basically what the clearance is.
So now we'll go ahead and do the best we can to line ours up. And if I had to look at this, looks like we have about 2/1000 main bearing clearance, which is what I'm looking to do. So we've got about 2/1000 right there on the rear. And then we'll look at a couple of the other ones here. We'll look at the front one. Yep, about 2/1000 again. Come to this one. Yep, about 2/1000. And this one here. Yeah. So it looks like I'm running about 2/1000 of an inch is exactly where I want to be for my main bearing clearances. So what I'm going to do now is clean up all this residue. So let me go ahead and clean all this up. Now that I've got this done, torque the main caps back on one more time. Check my crank end play real quick. And then I'll go ahead and put the rear main seal in at that point in time. And then I'll take the crank out, lubricate basically all the journals and all the bearings, and we'll torque down the crank for the final time. All right, guys. So now what I've done is I've got the crank back in again. I've got all the plastic gauge all cleaned off. I bolted the main caps back on with no oil, no rear main yet seal. And now you can see I've set up a dial indicator on the end of the crankshaft and I've zeroed it. And basically what we want to do is see what our crankshaft end play is. And so I'll take a couple stills and put it in there, but basically, you know, if we kind of go and do this, you know, from that's about 0 there to here, it's about 4/1000 of an inch, which is where we want to be between 2 and 7/1000. So our crank end play is pretty darn good at 4/1000 of an inch. Again, 0, just give it a little pry. You can see it's right about 4/1000 of an inch. So we got good crank end play. So now what I am going to do is I'm going to take these main caps off one last time. I'm going to put in my rear main seal, and then I'm going to put some oil on all the bearings. I'm going to take the crank out, you know, lube the bottom half of the bearing and the top half of the caps, just a little bit of assembly lube, and then go ahead and torque them for the final time. And then we'll go on to the piston rings. All right, guys, so here's where we're going to put in the rear main seal. And so, per the directions, what you want to do is you'll notice here a difference in the size of the lip. You'll see this is a big lip. It's a little wider here. You'll see this is a thin lip here. So basically you want the thin lip facing out, and you want the big lip facing towards the front of the engine. So all we need to do is take it, pop it in like so. All right. And then do the same thing for the main cap. So we want the main cap's going to go on like this way. So we want the seal to go in this way. So again, with the main cap, face the thick part of the lip towards the bearing and the thin lip to the outside of the engine. Just pop her in here like so. And you've got the rear main seal installed. Now, what the directions also say is to put some RTV along the outside edges here to prevent leaking. Okay, so we'll put some RTV here in just a moment. But the other thing is to put some oil or grease on the lip of the seal. Now, since my engine's not going to be running most likely for a few days, actually probably several weeks, because I'm going to double check the transmission, is I'm going to put grease on both of these, and that's again what the directions say to do. So if you're going to start your engine up right away within the next day or two, you can just put a light amount of oil on here. But since mine's going to be sitting for a little bit, probably several weeks before I actually put it in, I'm going to put a light coat of grease on here. So I just wanted to show you guys, you know, about the rear main seal. Again, lip thick lip towards the front of the engine, thin lip towards the back of the engine. A little bit of RTV here and here, just to seal this up. And then I'm gonna either use a little bit of grease or oil depending on when you're gonna start it. So just wanted to show you guys that real fast. Now I'm gonna go ahead and oil up my bearings with some assembly lube, drop the crank back in and torque it for the final time. All right, guys, so you can see you've got the crank in now. It's bolted in for good. You know, I've got the rear mains all put in and greased up and everything. You know, you saw the couple of stills where I, used my comp cams assembly lube. And you can see, this thing turns over nice and smooth. So the other thing you may notice is one bolt looks a little different than the rest. You'll notice right here, I'm running a stud. The reason I'm running a stud is because of this oil pan. And this is a Kevco oil pan. It's a 6-quart oil pan that I'm putting into my A-body Mopar. And, it's got a little bit of a scraper here. You can see it down in here. It's got a couple of flap doors, for oil. So it's a nice oil pan. I really like it. And the reason I have that stud there is because, let me grab my oil pump. When I go to put the oil pump in, you can see I need a stud to bolt it down. So that way, this isn't flopping around. So if you guys are doing a stock rebuild on your 5.9 Magnum for your truck, you don't need to worry about this. If you're swapping in this into, like say an A body, something like that, I believe this stud is I bought that from Meladon, and that is a big block Chevy stud, believe it or not. So it works really good with, the arm here. I think if I remember right, I think I had to grind this just a little bit to get it to fit. But I maybe had to bend it, I don't remember. But it fits, works really well. So basically I put in a Meladon big block Chevy oil stud, if I remember right. And then I just used the rest of the remaining stock cap bolts from there. So we've got the rotating assembly basically. Well, we've got the crank in, not the rotating assembly, but we've got the crank in. Next thing now is I'm gonna flip the block over. And we'll start measuring out the oil pump, or I'm sorry, the piston rings.